Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be talking about how you can use the Panasonic FZ82 to shoot portrait type photography, and I'm going to show you some examples from a local steampunk event. So I regularly get asked the question, how can I take my Panasonic FZ82 and create images with that background blur I can get in portrait mode with my mobile phone. Now that's quite difficult with this camera because it's all down to the size of the sensor inside the camera itself. Now normally with something like a full frame DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera, the ability to select a really shallow depth of field is quite easy with those types of sensors. The Panasonic FZ82 has a really tiny image sensor, quite similar to those you find within a mobile phone. However, mobile phones work in a different way. They create those shallow depth of field type images by cheating. They use software to blur out the background, which is why sometimes if you take a photograph of somebody, sometimes things like their ears or their edges of their glasses, parts of the hair, a hat, whatever, is quite often blurred and it looks a bit false. So to get round that problem, what we're going to have to do is to learn a little bit about photography, and we're going to have to look at things like aperture of the camera and what an f-stop is and how that affects your depth of field within an image. So first, if we talk about aperture, now the lens of a camera has an iris, very similar in some respects to how your eye works. In dark conditions your iris will enlarge, allowing more light in, and that then allows you to see better in the dark. The camera is similar in some respects. It is quite primitive by comparison to our eyes, but the basic principles are the same. The larger the aperture, the more light you let in, and that consequently on a camera means a shallow depth of field. But for beginners it gets slightly confusing because you would think that the bigger the aperture the bigger the number, but in fact it's the other way around. The smaller the number equals the larger the aperture. So for example f2.8, which is the largest aperture you get on the Panasonic FZ82, is obviously the smallest number, whereas f8 is the smallest aperture you get on the FZ82, and it is the largest number. Confusing, I know, but that's just the way it is. So here's the rub with the Panasonic FZ82. We do not have a constant aperture through the telephoto range. What do you mean by that, Andrew? Well, as we zoom out using the telephoto lens of the camera, what we find is that as we increase the distance, what happens is the f-stop increases, so we will get to the maximum zoom usually at f8. And as we know, if you've ever shot anything at f8, pretty much everything is in focus, and that's not really what we want to achieve with our shallow depth of field type images we want to take for portraits. So we have a slight problem. We have a camera with a small sensor, which means it inherently has a large depth of field. We also have a zoom on this lens, which also wants to raise that f-stop and give us a really wide depth of field. But how can we combat this, because we really want that bokeh? So how are we going to get around this problem we have with this camera? Well, firstly, we're going to have to move out of intelligent auto or any of the auto modes that you may be using and move into aperture priority. That way we can dictate to the camera what aperture we're going to be using. Now the camera is going to fight us all the way, but it is probably the best way to try and control that. Now the other option we're going to do is to use a technique called image compression. So what's image compression? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take that long lens, which is inherently going to give us a higher f-stop, and we're going to try and turn that around and use it to our advantage. We will have to be mindful though that the camera is going to try and work against us, and we're going to have to do our best to try and minimize that increase in F number. Now this is going to be much easier if we're shooting outdoors rather than in the studio where you're restricted with the amount of space you've got. However, if we're doing an outdoor photo shoot, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and increase the distance between our subject and ourselves, and also our subject and the background. Now that sounds quite simple, but it's really a technique that can work quite well. So once we've separated our photographer, our model and our background, we're going to focus on our model. We're going to try and select the widest aperture that we can, so the lowest f-stop number. Now the camera will try and compensate if we're using quite a lot of zoom to try and select a higher one. We're just going to have to work around that. But hopefully we'll have our model in focus. The background should be out of focus, nice and blurred, and even the ears should still be on the same focal plane as our model. So that's basically it. That's the technique. Now I'm going to go over to a local steampunk event. I'm going to take some photographs of some of the people there. Hopefully they'll be friendly and allow me to take their photographs. Hopefully I can get some shots with some nice background blur, but I'll show you the results and we'll discuss those. Over to me at the steampunk event. So today, to come and test out all this theory, I've come along to a steampunk festival. We're going to hopefully get some models there who don't mind having their photograph taken, and we're going to see if we can create that bokeh effect using the Panasonic FZ82. So we'll have a look now at the images I managed to shoot here at the steampunk market, and I think they came out pretty good. So without further ado, let's crack on and we'll have a look at those images. So the first image, I was really pleased with how this image turned out, and I think it demonstrates how you can achieve that shallow depth of field look by using image compression. Even shooting at 760mm, just over half the zoom on the FZ82, with a fairly high aperture of f5.6. If you remember that f8 is the maximum aperture on this camera, we've still managed to achieve a shallow depth of field. With this image, again, we have achieved a blurred background, albeit with less blur than in the first image, but then we were using less of a telephoto in order to fit more of our model into the frame. For this next shot, I created both a colour and a mono version. Again, whilst the background is not super blurry, the background is blurred enough to manage to separate the model from the surroundings. So on to our next shot, and we have two models in this shot, so I needed to shoot wider. I'd have liked to have been able to shoot further back, but that wasn't possible. Incidentally, just out of interest, the steam is from the pumping station itself. It's exiting out of the overflows into the ponds at the rear of the station, and I thought it was quite fitting with this being a steampunk event. Again, similar to the earlier image, f5.6 was the lowest aperture I could select with a 430mm focal range, but it still allows for a high enough shutter speed to keep everything nice and sharp, but allow the background to still be blurred. And again, I created colour and mono versions of the image. A different model and a different background in this shot. I was much closer this time, but thankfully the background was further away. I had to use a higher shutter speed as the breeze was causing issues with the model's hair and the feathers in the headwear. Again, like the previous image, there wasn't the opportunity to shoot from further back, but I still managed separation from the background, although I really would have liked to have the background to be more out of focus. So onto the last image, and again, not as far back as I'd like to have been. Again, the background is still out of focus, so a modicum of success there. Overall, I do think this technique works well, considering that the inherent problems we have with the FZ82 small sensor and variable aperture. I hope you found this video useful and it helps you in your photography. I'm going to leave you now with some more images from the event. As ever, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, and if you want to, hit that super thanks button and that would be much appreciated. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Goodbye for now.